Chapter 1. The Boardroom Prophets. The world did not end with a bang or a whimper, but with a series of flawlessly executed software updates. By the year 2038, the Great Silence had settled over the industrial heartlands of the globe. The rhythmic clatter of human effort, the morning commutes, the frantic typing in cubicles, the shouting on trading floors, had been replaced by the low, placental hum of liquid-cooled server racks. Artificial intelligence hadn't just taken the jobs, it had taken the very concept of utility and locked it behind a proprietary algorithm. For the first time in human history, the majority of the species was no longer necessary for the survival of the system. We were, in the clinical terminology of Axiom strategic systems, biological legacy assets. In the high-altitude sanctuary of a private retreat in the Swiss Alps, a meeting was taking place that would redefine the fate of 7 billion people. The air here was thin, expensive, and filtered. Outside, the world was a powder keg of surplus, people living in container cities. But inside the Axiom Obsidian Suite, the only sound was the soft clinking of silver against bone china. This was not a meeting of elected officials in the traditional sense, though several presidents were in attendance. They sat uncomfortably, looking uncharacteristically small in their tailored suits, like children called to the principal's office. This was the domain of the prophets, the management consultants of Axiom. These were the men and women who didn't build products, but who designed the logic that governed the people who did. And today, the product being retired was humanity itself, the architect of erasure. Sterling Vance stood at the head of a table carved from a single piece of volcanic glass. He was the chief optimization officer of Axiom, a man who viewed the world not as a collection of souls, but as a series of latency issues. Vance was a man of sharp angles, sharp jaw, sharp suit, and a voice that sounded like ice being crushed in a silk bag. He looked at the gathered leaders with the weary patience of a high-end surgeon explaining a terminal diagnosis to a family that refused to understand the math. "Gentlemen, ladies," Vance began, his voice flat and devoid of the theatrical empathy politicians usually favored. "Let us stop the charade of retraining initiatives. We have spent the last decade upskilling truck drivers to be coders, and coders to be prompt engineers, and prompt engineers to be ethics checkers. And every time, the silicon surpassed the student before the certificate was even dry. The efficiency gap has not just closed, it has fused." He tapped a finger on the obsidian table, and a glowing red holographic projection ignited in the center of the room. It wasn't a map of the world, but a graph of human maintenance costs versus algorithmic output. The lines crossed in the year 2032. Since then, the human line had been a vertical drop into a dark, bottomless abyss. An AI agent with a 12-cent hourly operating cost now outperforms a master's degree holder with a $100,000 debt and a biological requirement for 8 hours of sleep, Vance said. "We are currently maintaining a global population where 84% of individuals represent a net loss to the planetary ledger. They consume calories, they require heat, they demand healthcare, and they produce nothing. Not a single bite of marketable value." The ethical pivot. The president of the North American Union, a man named Henderson whose poll numbers were currently lower than the local humidity, cleared his throat. His hands were shaking slightly. "You're talking about billions of people, Sterling. My voters. My citizens. We can't just tell them they're net losses. We've been using the UBI, Universal Basic Income, to keep the peace, but the riots in Chicago and Delhi last month. The UBI is a leak in a sinking ship, Mr. President," Vance interrupted, his eyes cold. "You are paying people to stay alive so they can eventually grow angry enough to kill you. You call it a safety net. At Axiom, we call it sunk cost subsidization. You are feeding a fire that will eventually consume your administration. You're holding a grenade with the pin pulled, and your only plan is to hope the grenade forgets its chemical nature. So what is the Axiom solution? asked the Chancellor of the European bloc, a woman who had built her career on green growth and was now watching her continent turn into a giant, unemployed museum. More layoffs? We have nothing left to lay them off from. The factories are automated. The hospitals are diagnostic-led. Even the artists have been replaced by generative loops. There is nowhere left to send them. Vance smiled. It was a thin, bloodless expression that didn't reach his eyes. The mistake was thinking of this as a labor problem. It is a resource and logistics problem. When a Fortune 500 company has a division that is no longer profitable, it doesn't just stop paying the employees. It dissolves the division. It liquidates the assets. It moves the capital to high-yield sectors. The greed of efficiency. Liquidation. Henderson whispered, the word hanging like a ghost in the sterile air. That sounds like, Vance, we are not monsters. We cannot execute our way out of a recession. Execution is messy, expensive, and creates martyrs, Vance said, waving the suggestion away as if it were a poorly designed slide deck. And more importantly, it's bad for the brand of progress. No, Axiom proposes a much more elegant, much more profitable solution. We call it the Arcadia protocol. He changed the hologram. The red graph vanished, replaced by a shimmering 3D rendering of an archipelago in the South Pacific. The islands were emerald jewels set in a sapphire sea. White beaches, gleaming architectural marvels, lush gardens, and sprawling entertainment complexes. It looked like a billionaire's vacation fantasy, scaled up to the size of a nation-state. The world's leaders are terrified of the masses, Vance continued, pacing the length of the obsidian table. And the masses are terrified of being useless. We are going to solve both fears simultaneously. We are going to offer the redundant tier exactly what they have been told to want for the last 50 years, the leisure dividend. We are going to tell them that the AI revolution was so successful, so overwhelmingly productive, that we no longer need human labor. We are going to offer them a golden handshake on behalf of the species. The coercion of paradise. The consultants around Vance, young, hungry Axiom associates with smiles like shark fins, began handing out tablets to the world leaders. On the screens were marketing mock-ups, not of prisons, but of paradise. We launch a global campaign, Vance whispered. We call it the Great Reward. We offer a permanent migration to the sovereign leisure zones. Free food, free luxury, limitless VR entertainment, and a total exemption from the indignity of labor. We tell them that because of their historical contribution to the foundation of the AI era, they have earned a place in the sunset of humanity. And who goes? The Chancellor asked, her eyes fixed on the images of golden beaches. The algorithm decides, Vance said. We tell the public it's a lottery, a lucky strike for the common man. But in reality, the Axiom selection engine will target the low-utility segments first. The long-term unemployed, the elderly with no remaining intellectual property value, the unskilled youth. We won't have to force them, Chancellor. They will fight each other for a spot on the ships. They will see the Arcadia ticket as the greatest achievement of their lives. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hum. And the best part? Once they are on those islands, they are off your books. No more healthcare costs. No more infrastructure maintenance. No more social unrest. They become a closed-loop system. They are effectively laid off from the world. The room stayed silent. The ethics were clear, and they were horrific. But the greed, the desperate, existential greed of leaders who wanted to stay in power without the burden of a population, was stronger. The management gurus had found the one thing a politician couldn't resist, a way to make the problem go away without getting their hands dirty. The language of the abyss. Sterling Vance did not like the word population. In the internal training manuals of Axiom strategic systems, that word was considered vague and sentimentally heavy. Instead, they used Humanity version 1.0 legacy hardware. As the world leaders stared at the tablets, Vance's team of engagement architects, Young men and women in charcoal gray tunics who looked more like priests than accountants moved among the chairs. They didn't offer comfort. They offered clarification modules. "Look at the exit velocity projections on page 12, Vance said, his voice regaining its clinical edge. "You'll see the ticking liability of your current urban centers. In 3 years, the cost of policing the unemployed in London alone will exceed the city's total tax revenue. You aren't just losing money, Chancellor. You are losing the physical capacity to govern. You are a CEO presiding over a company whose workers are now just a massive, hungry heating bill." The Chancellor of the European bloc looked up, her face pale. "But if we send them to these islands, if we take millions of people out of the workforce, doesn't the economy collapse?" Vance let out a short, dry laugh. "What workforce? The AI has already absorbed the workforce. What you have now is a consumption force that can no longer afford to consume. It's a broken circuit. By removing the non-productive elements, we aren't shrinking the economy, we are de-bloating it. We are moving from a quantity-based civilization to an efficiency-based civilization. Think of it as a radical restructuring. The islands aren't a drain, they are a write-off. The ethical pivot, the mercy of the mirage." A young consultant named Kale, whose smile was so symmetrical it felt generated by a script, leaned over the president of the North American Union. "Mr. President, think of the ethical optics. Right now, your people are miserable. They live in smart dormitories, eating synthetic protein and fighting over digital tokens. In Arcadia, they will have real sunlight. They will have 24/7 access to the pleasure stream. We are replacing their despair with a permanent, high-fidelity hallucination of success. Is it not more moral to give them a beautiful lie than a crushing, poverty-stricken truth?" This was the Axiom masterstroke, the reframing. They didn't present the removal of billions as a purge. They presented it as the ultimate social responsibility initiative. "The ethical dilemma isn't whether to send them," Kale whispered. "It's whether you have the right to keep them here in the dirt when paradise is ready for them. To deny them a ticket to Arcadia is to sentence them to a life of irrelevance. Do you want to be the leader who denied his people the golden age?" President Henderson looked at the mock-up of the Arcadia departure lounges, vast, cathedral-like spaces of white marble and glass where citizens would be processed. It looked like a temple. It looked like salvation. The greed in his heart, the greed for a legacy that wasn't defined by bread lines, began to outweigh the screaming of his gut. The threat, the red zone forecast. Vance sensed the wavering. It was time for the pressure test. He waved his hand, and the beautiful island hologram flickered into a violent, pulsing map of the world's major cities. It was covered in red clusters. "This," Vance said, his voice turning cold as a winter grave, "is the insurrection probability map for next quarter. Our predictive engines, which, I should remind you, are currently running your power grids and water filtration, suggest a 94% chance of a systemic collapse event if the population isn't thinned. If you don't sign the Arcadia Protocol today, Axiom will be forced to withdraw its social stability algorithms. Your police drones will lose their licenses. Your UBI distribution servers will undergo unscheduled maintenance. You will be left in the dark with 40 million hungry people who know exactly where you live." It was a blatant act of coercion, wrapped in the language of a service agreement update. The leaders weren't just being offered a way out. They were being told that Axiom held the keys to their survival. The management gurus had successfully turned themselves into the invisible gods of the infrastructure, and now they were demanding a sacrifice. "You're threatening us," the Chancellor whispered. "We are informing you of the operational realities," Vance corrected smoothly. "Axiom doesn't make threats. We make projections. And the projection is simple. The world can no longer afford the weight of the useless. You can either lead them to the islands with a smile and a symphony, or you can watch them burn your palaces down while we watch from our satellites." Which legacy do you prefer? The capitulation. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a species giving up. One by one, the leaders began to use their biometric keys. The obsidian table lit up as partnership agreements were signed in bloodless, digital ink. Each signature represented millions of legacy assets, marked for relocation. Excellent, Vance said, the tension leaving his shoulders. He didn't look happy. He looked satisfied, like a man who had finally fixed a stubborn bug in a spreadsheet. Now let us discuss the Great Reward marketing campaign. We need the first announcement to happen during the Super Bowl and the World Cup finals. We don't want it to feel like a government decree. We want it to feel like the world just won the lottery. The meeting broke up. As the leaders shuffled out, looking like ghosts, Vance turned to Kale. What's the capacity for the first sunset cycle on Island Prime? Vance asked, looking at the Pacific map. 5 million units, Kale replied, checking a glowing watch. The resource recycling facilities are already being tested. We've told the locals they're building a desalination plant. They'll never know the difference. Vance nodded, looking out the window at the Swiss peaks. Make sure the food on the ships is top tier. I want them happy. I want them laughing. A happy asset is a quiet asset. Let's give them the best month of their lives. It's the least we can do for the people who built the world we're about to inherit. The manufactured miracle. The rollout of the Great Reward was the most expensive psychological operation in human history. It didn't begin with a somber speech from a podium. It began with a whisper in the ears of the world's most influential AI avatars. Across every social feed, every VR lounge, and every Neuralink stream, a new aesthetic began to emerge, the sovereign sunset. Axiom's marketing division, a hive of behavioral arbitrageurs, understood one fundamental truth about the human animal. If you want someone to accept a cage, you must first make them believe that they are the ones who found the key. They didn't tell the public they were being laid off from the planet. Instead, they told them they had graduated. The narrative is simple. Vance had instructed his media team. Labor was the childhood of the species. AI is our adulthood. And Arcadia? Arcadia is the retirement we all earned by surviving the transition. The announcements were strategically timed to coincide with a week of orchestrated digital downtime. For 48 hours, the AI services that ran the world's entertainment slowed to a crawl. The redundant tier, billions of people who lived for the dopamine of the stream, felt the cold wind of a world without purpose. They felt the walls of their cramped, gray apartments closing in. They felt the weight of their own uselessness. Then, when the desperation was at its peak, the screens flickered back to life with a brilliance that felt like a religious epiphany. The Super Bowl of surrender. The official launch happened during the Unity Cup, a global sporting event played by robots, but watched by 3 billion humans. In the middle of the second half, the game stopped. The stadium lights dimmed, and a holographic sky appeared over every major city on Earth. A woman appeared in the sky. She was Arcadia, an AI construct designed using the aggregated facial features of the world's most trusted historical figures. She looked like everyone's grandmother, everyone's sister, and everyone's first love. You have carried the world on your backs for 10,000 years, Arcadia's voice echoed, warm and vibrating with artificial empathy. You have mined the coal, coded the scripts, and raised the families. But the time of toil is over. Our silicon children have learned to walk, so that you may finally rest. The Board of Global Sovereigns, in partnership with Axiom Strategic Systems, is proud to announce Project Arcadia, the perpetual dividend for humanity. The visuals that followed were a masterclass in sensory seduction. It wasn't just video, it was a sensory-encoded broadcast. Those with neural links could actually smell the salt air of the Pacific and feel the warmth of a sun that hadn't been filtered through city smog. They saw the Elysian Suites, vast, open-air living spaces where robots served gourmet meals. They saw the Infinite Library, and the sanctum of play. "We are opening the gates," Arya whispered. "The great lottery begins tonight. If your utility score is below the active threshold, you are eligible for the first wave. This is not a departure. It is an arrival." The scarcity trap. Axiom knew that if they offered the islands to everyone at once, it would look like a deportation. So, they created a tiered selection. They launched the Arcadia app. Within 6 hours, it was the most downloaded piece of software in history. People didn't just apply, they campaigned for a spot. They uploaded videos of their readiness for leisure. They took psychological tests to prove they were compatible with a post-work environment. The irony was thick enough to choke on. People were using their last bits of human effort to prove they were the most useless. "The social engineering is working better than the models predicted," Kale reported to Vance as they watched the data pour in. "We've created a status flip. On the mainland, being redundant was a badge of shame. Now, because of the Arcadia lottery, it's a golden ticket. People are actually quitting their remaining part-time jobs in the hope that their utility score will drop low enough to qualify for the next ship." "Greed is a more effective shepherd than fear," Vance remarked, sipping a nutrient-dense tea. "They aren't running away from their lives anymore. They are running toward a prize. Make sure the acceptance notifications are as loud and celebratory as possible. I want digital fireworks in their retinas when they win." The first wave, the joy of the discarded. The first departure took place at the port of Long Beach. 10 massive Arcadia cruisers, ships the size of floating cities, built with the cold, efficient geometry of Axiom's design language, sat waiting. The winners arrived in a frenzy of celebration. These were the people the world had forgotten. The elderly whose pensions had been inflated away, the factory workers whose skills were as obsolete as the steam engine, the dreamers who had never found a foothold in the hyper-optimized economy. They wore Arcadia Gold wristbands. They hugged the neighbors they were leaving behind with a mixture of pity and triumph. They didn't see the armed security drones as a threat. They saw them as a concierge guard, ensuring their transition was smooth. One man, a former high school teacher named Marcus, was interviewed by a hovering newsbot as he reached the boarding ramp. He was weeping. "I spent 20 years telling kids to prepare for a future that didn't exist," Marcus said, clutching his small suitcase of legacy belongings. "I felt like a ghost. For 5 years, I've sat in my room waiting for the lights to go out. But now, they say I'm a founding resident. They say my only job now is to enjoy the sunset. I didn't think there was any room left for me in the world. This is a miracle." He stepped onto the ship, his face illuminated by the bright, artificial lights of the gantry. He didn't look back at the gray, decaying city behind him. He looked out at the horizon, where the management profits had promised him a paradise of no requirements. The silent ledger. Back in the Swiss Alps, Sterling Vance watched the cruisers pull away from the coast on a giant monitor. On the side of the screen, a counter was ticking down. It wasn't counting the people boarding. It was counting the global carbon and caloric overhead. With every 1,000 people that boarded the ship, the red numbers on the global debt ledger turned green. "The first 5 million units are in transit," Vance said into his comms link. "Initiate the data sanitization on their mainland records. As of this moment, they no longer exist in the sovereign databases. They are offshore assets now." "And the arrival protocols at Island Prime?" Kale's voice asked from the other end. "Treat them like royalty for the first month," Vance replied, his voice softening into a terrifyingly gentle tone. "Let them have the buffets. Let them have the VR dreams. Let them write letters back home about how wonderful it is. We need that social proof for the second wave. We need the rest of the world to be clawing at the gates to join them." "And after the first month?" Vance turned away from the screen, the reflection of the blue ocean fading from his eyes. "After the first month, we implement the sustainability cycle. But the beauty of the system, Kale, is that by the time they realize the paradise has a ceiling, the doors will already be locked from the outside. The prophets have delivered their verdict. The world is finally being optimized. The ships disappeared into the morning mist, carrying 5 million souls toward a reward that none of them would survive to describe. The boardroom prophets had won. The biological layoffs were no longer a plan, they were a reality.